Hola, buenos días a todos. Good morning to everybody. Como decía Piluca, pues nada, es un placer que estéis aquí con nosotros y poder contar con Alastair Carrington para explicarnos un poco el fascinante mundo de los PPAs. Como decía Piluca, el seminario va a ser en inglés, entonces, pero las preguntas, si hay algún problema en hacerla en inglés, pues me la ponéis en español y yo se las traduzco. Pero como efectivamente la ponencia va a ser en inglés y por eso voy a cambiar entonces, para darle la bienvenida, cambio al inglés. Good morning, Alastair. It's a pleasure to have you with us. And good morning to everybody around the world, of the many countries that are from where you are following us. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today here in this webinar. We have so to say, the luxury to count on Alastair Carrington, which is in charge of PPAs in GE, to explain us a little bit what is happening around this business at the moment. I was just speaking with Alastair before we started, and he told me that he has been since 2008 working on PPA issues, so he certainly knows how the baby has grown up. And so he's going to tell us how big is this market currently. So I won't take your time any more longer, and so I give you the floor, Alastair, and please go ahead with your presentation.
Great. Thanks, Heikki, and for the introduction, and thanks, Piluca, and to AE for inviting GE to present at the webinar. Can I just check everyone can see the screen? Can everyone see the slide?
At the moment, I still see the initial screen.
Fine. Okay. Here we go.
Okay. Now it's okay. Perfect.
Yeah. Fine. Okay. So yeah, thanks, Heikki, and to AE in general for inviting GE to the webinar. As Heikki's set out, the topic we've been asked to talk about is PPAs. It's a subject that's been widely discussed over the last 18-24 months and more. And today, I'm just going to sort of share some of our thoughts, some of my thoughts, and what we are seeing in practice across Europe. And hopefully, GE doesn't need any real introduction to the audience. But let me start. I'll introduce myself. It's Alastair Carrington. I work out of our London office. I work in what we call our commercial partnering team here at GE, and we sort of partner with our customers to jointly develop early to late stage projects across Europe and globally. As a business, we offer sort of development capital in the form of loans or equity, as well as expertise and support for credit support for auctions, grid planning, etc. My particular role here is sourcing, structuring, negotiating power purchase agreements or offtake solutions for both the investments that GE are making, but also for our for customers of GE's. And we also work with our capital division through Energy Financial Services, and there, we offer sort of structuring expertise and access to investors, lenders, ECAs, DFIs across a range of markets. So I've put together a short agenda. It's designed to, prompt a little bit of discussion, and there's certainly time for Q&A afterwards. I've got about 20 minutes probably of slides, 25 minutes. I'm going to take you through some basic introduction. So what is a PPA? Some of the key drivers, developers and off-takers. I'm going to talk you through just the different types of delivery. So we get a physically delivered PPA, very common in the UK and Northern Europe. And then I guess what the audience will be far more aware of is the sort of financial structure, and we'll touch on that. We'll talk through some of the pricing structures that we see and are increasingly beginning to see. We'll talk through the development of PPAs in Europe, what we've seen over the last few years, what we're seeing right now. We're seeing huge growth, and we'll talk about that. And then just some key themes. So we'll touch on COVID. I couldn't go through a PPA presentation without talking about the impact of COVID. We'll talk about routes to market, what we're seeing, what changes we're seeing. Standardization is a big theme, and then we'll touch on some of the innovation that we're seeing in the market. As Palika and Heikki have said, that there's an opportunity to ask questions, and hopefully will prompt a bit of discussion either as you go through or towards the end of the presentation. So let's start with a very simple slide. What's a renewable power purchase agreement? It's a fairly generic term. Amongst others, could be a contract with a utility or a trader for a route to market, or a longer term sort of price agreement. But all agreements are essentially a contract between a generator and a consumer or a buyer of electricity for the sale, purchase, and delivery of electricity. The electricity is purchased at a pre-agreed price for an agreed volume and tenor. And the drivers and the trends we're seeing for developers, stroke investors haven't really changed over the last few years. There is a removal of subsidies across Europe, although we may be seeing some of those brought back with auctions reappearing. So of course there's a bit of unpredictability in the sort of political environment we find ourselves in, and that combined with very volatile market conditions, no more than we've seen in the last 6 months, means that project co's and developers are looking for changing or having to adapt to changing business and revenue models. And there's a drive to secure long-term, I won't say fixed prices, but certainly some more predictability in their longer-term revenue streams. And then if we look for what's driving the the buyers, firstly, it's a mix, probably economics and sustainability reasons, but economics, a long-term PPA, with the right pricing structure, does provide a hedge against rising electricity prices. I think even given what we've seen in the last 6 months, the general consensus is that wholesale electricity prices are rising. In the long term, medium to long term. A number of those early corporate PPAs adopted were relatively straightforward pricing structures, fixed prices, which would escalate or not with inflation. And although they act as an important price hedge for buyers, they also bear risk if markets move lower. And in some markets, we're seeing more sophisticated pricing structures, and we'll talk about those shortly. There's also very conscious support for carbon-free electricity, sustainability commitments for these buyers. A large number of corporations have set very ambitious targets for renewable energy sourcing or emissions reduction, whether that is through leading organisations such as RE100 or independently. And meeting those commitments, there are a number of ways that can be done. Relatively simply through, I guess, the utility procurement program, or through matching of certificates, whether that's RECs in the US or guarantees of origin in Europe. But increasingly, corporations want to go beyond that. They want to look for opportunities where they can demonstrate additionality. And by additionality, we mean that a corporate or a buyer of electricity who can commit to long-term procurement of generation can support investment in new plant, and hence the generation of new sort of clean green electricity onto the grid. And it's becoming increasingly important for a number of buyers. So we'll just talk about the two different options that we see in the market. We'll talk firstly about a physical power purchase agreement. As I said earlier, this is what is very common certainly in the UK, in Northern Europe, in Nordic markets. It's not really seen so much in Southern Europe, and it's simply a contract between the generator and the consumer for the sale, purchase, and delivery of the electricity. So the generator delivers electricity to, and the buyer receives electricity from the grid, but the electricity is delivered through the grid by the utility, a third party, so a balancing responsible party, or the relevant grid operator, and it kind of depends on the jurisdiction. The advantage of that is it allows a direct delivery of power from the generating station to the point of consumption, and it increases the transparency around consumption of green electricity. It can be structured so that certificates can be transferred to the off-taker, and the electricity is generally produced and consumed in the same market and/or price zone. It's also probably easier to contract with multiple projects for single load or all loads. Some of the disadvantages where it's geographically restrictive. The load has to be in the same market or price zone. It needs to be accommodated within the existing electricity supply arrangements. So, a consumer has to work with its current utility or supplier to make sure that they can account for the new load coming in, which adds complications when you're talking about a shaped production. So, generation from a solar plant or a PV plant. It requires a licensed party to transfer the electricity through the net, through the grid, and there's costs involved in that, and who allocating those costs needs to be agreed between the parties, and then there's extra resource required to administer that that contract. And then hopefully we'll talk about the financial power purchase agreement. So this is hopefully what the audience is very, very familiar with in Spain. It's there's some terms that are interchangeable, but it's a financial or virtual synthetic PPA. It's a financial contract for difference, sometimes referred to as a fixed floating swap. So the generator and the buyer enter into an agreement to settle against an agreed price structure for an agreed underlying volume. The generator continues to sell electricity produced into the wholesale market, and the consumer continues to buy power through its existing utility arrangements, and the contract is then settled at agreed intervals, where the direction of payment is simply determined by the difference between the wholesale market price and the reference or the strike price. Again, advantages, it's flexible. It allows buyers to aggregate load within or across markets. For example, buyers with consumption across multiple sites might look to this as an option. It's not restrained or restricted by geography, and that allows consumers to access a wider pool of generators and generators to access a wider pool of buyers in different markets. There is no disruption to existing supply arrangements. And then again, you can structure the contract so the certificates can be transferred to the off-taker. Some disadvantages, especially for the buyers, it is considered a financial instrument, and so generally there will be specific accounting treatment and derivative reporting requirements for the buyer. It can lead to basis risk. So if you are entering into PPAs in one market to effectively hedge your load in another market, it leads to basis risk where the prices are different and the settlement is different, and that will impact the hedge effectiveness of the PPA. There are a number of these sorts of contracts being written or struck, and I don't think one should underestimate the impact that basis risk can have. For some corporates or buyers, it's less tangible because there is no physical delivery of electricity, and some perceive that to be less green, for want of a better explanation. And there's obviously counterparty credit risk because there are two-way cash flows. Both parties need to be comfortable with the credit risk, and there will be credit support required. And again, there's some extra resource in administrating those contracts. So let's talk about what we're seeing in Europe right now. You've just seen these graphs before. This one's from Bloomberg New Energy Finance. It simply shows a huge growth in corporate PPAs over the last 10 years. Now, they're not a new phenomenon. The first deals, certainly in the UK, were being struck 10, 12 years ago, with retailers, with aggregates business, but the market is certainly accelerating. It's maturing as the size and frequency of those deals has increased in recent years. And the leading global corporations are looking at PPAs as a solution to sit alongside their existing procurement activities. What's interesting is that there's actually a real mix of industries too now entering into these types of contracts. So whereas if we looked at this last year, you'll find in 2019 the volume of PPAs was dominated by some of the big tech firms. We'll see in 2020, that's changed, and the companies I put on the slide here are just some examples of companies that have announced PPAs in 2020. You can see the telecoms businesses, chemicals, consumer goods, retail, forestry, brewing, transport, and we're seeing a real range of businesses coming to market looking for procurement. And in Europe now, cumulatively, the capacity is over 8 gigawatts of PPAs that have been struck. In 2020, we've seen over 1 gigawatt already announced. Another one was announced yesterday in Sweden. We've seen over 500 megawatts in Spain already this year, 200 megawatts in Finland, 100 in Sweden. I say it's a mix of the physical and virtual or financial PPAs that we discussed in the last couple of slides. And it's probably a 50-50 split between solar and wind right now, slightly more on solar, I'd suggest, in the last year. So I just wanted to touch on some of the sort of structures that we're seeing. There's two slides on Pbs structures. Whilst the settlement is slightly different, whether you're in a physical or a financial PPA, the general theme can apply to both types of structure. So the first of those is the fixed price structure, is what we've seen, or most people would have seen. This structure is certainly the most common, and it's where it allows the buyers and sellers or the seller to secure a fixed revenue stream for the duration of the contract. So you simply agree a fixed price. Settlement will generally be against a wholesale market index, hourly, daily, monthly. Delivery can be either pairs produced or fixed volume. More common is pairs produced, but increasingly we're seeing requests for fixed volume baseload delivery. Indexation is generally zero, although in the UK for some reason these contracts are generally indexed against the retail index, and the tenor historically has been sort of 10 years plus. Certainly in the last 12 months we've seen that come down 8 years. In Spain maybe even lower. I think that's really driven by lenders and thoughts on future pricing. I think certainly in the current price environment, we're seeing requests for those tenors to be lower. And we'll see how that that develops. Next one is on the revenue, what I call the revenue sharing structures, and this is really where either buyers or sellers are reticent to enter into a fixed price arrangement and really want to have a share of the risk. And so buyers can gain discounted power price from subject to capping those power prices, but can share in lower prices at points during the contract. So the first of those is really what we call a discount to market with a floor price. So contract price where you'd agree a set discount, whether that is a percentage of the power price or euros per megawatt hour. And in return for that discount, the buyer would receive a floor price for the electricity. Essentially, it's a put option, and the premium for that option is the discount to the market. Again, settled on against the wholesale market index, hourly, daily, monthly. Can be pay as produced, can be fixed volume, and we've seen generally the floor price would not be indexed, but again we're seeing some flex in that. And then the next evolution, I guess, is the cap and floor. So where a seller doesn't want to give away a discount in return for that, they'll receive they'll have a cap to cap to the output. So you would agree a cap and a floor. So anywhere between the cap and the floor, the revenue is based on the wholesale power price, and if the power price drops below the floor, then the buyer will pay the floor price, and if the power price goes above the cap price, then the buyer will essentially pay the cap price. So both buyer and seller then are participating in the and accepting some risk in the wholesale power prices. And both of these structures we are seeing more and more common, and actually I would say in the last few months, due to the maybe due to the economic uncertainty we face, I would say these two are probably more common than fixed prices at the moment, certainly for buyers of electricity. And then we'll just come on to my final slide, which is really some of the key themes that we're seeing in the market. I can't really go through a presentation about PPAs without talking about COVID, and the economic downturn. It's a complex challenge. I don't know if there's any real answers yet, but some observations and thoughts on what we've seen over the last few months. The impact of COVID-19 has been felt across the wholesale power markets, mainly due to a drop in commodity prices, as well as uncertainty about medium-term electricity demand and broader macroeconomic environment. In terms of what we saw in March, the immediate impact was a big drop in near-term prices. Probably most sharply felt in Scandinavia. Prices dropped by sort of 35–40% in 2021 for 2022 delivery, but also that was in part due to environmental factors. Hydrological balance in Scandinavia is important to the power price, high wind output, but also we saw prices drop significantly in Germany, France, Spain, UK. But I guess it's important to note that whilst we saw those prices drop, we were already seeing wholesale prices being challenged. We were seeing falling gas prices, we were seeing weaker coal and carbon prices. We were seeing decreasing demand and increased supply of renewable penetration. So whilst to some extent we've seen a recovery of those prices as we've gained some normality back as we get through this first phase of COVID, that we shouldn't forget that there were challenging power prices pre-March, February, March. So I think it's interesting to sort of be interested to see whether this is a transitory shock or is this more of a sort of structural change? Is the situation we're in now the new normal? We've got low industrial demand, so there is a high share of renewables penetration, and that inevitably impacts short-term power prices because of a low marginal cost of generation. We've got pressure on consumption for oil and gas, which feeds through the power prices. We've got changes to transportation, especially urban transportations. We shift our working patterns. Yes, we've got increased digitalization, but this is all going to impact power prices as we move forward. But what I would say is that has created opportunities for corporate buyers. And as the previous slide suggested, we're seeing rising demand for renewable procurement. And from our perspective, what we see at GE across Europe, we're not seeing any fall in interest from buyers. In fact, we're seeing the opposite. We're seeing an increased number of interested buyers coming to market. You want to put a number, I'd say there's probably gigawatts of demand across Europe right now for people looking at, corporate buyers looking for long-term PPAs. So routes to market are changing. There's no evidence that these deals won't be struck. And of course, the traditional origination activity remains, but increasingly we're seeing new brokers come into the market, generally independent players, but also we're seeing US brokers come into Europe, often bringing with them US corporates who've got their own sort of processes and techniques that have been successful in the States. There are often fees associated with those services, and they're generally met by the seller, but will pass through to the buyer through the PPA price. The processes are becoming competitive, very competitive. RFPs are certainly the new norm for renewable procurement, and access is often limited to larger developers stroke investors. I guess important to note that some of those large energy intensive users do have their own procurement teams. They're experienced at running RFPs for renewable PPAs, and whilst others utilise advisors, it remains competitive. There's also the growth of technology platforms. Some of these are simply a place to post project details, and a number of those platforms actively bring buyers and sellers together through automated PPAs, and others provide a range of services to complement the procurement process, offering you price forecasts, insight into the market. We at GE have developed our own platform. It's called Green Accelerator. And I'd encourage you to log in and view the site. It will be launched in Spain. Standardization is something that we hear a lot about. It's challenging. There's certainly standardized contracts out there, such as the FET contract, which gives you a number of options for standard clauses. But what we don't have yet is really a standardized approach to procurement. As we've already discussed, there are many parties, buyers, sellers, lenders, and other intermediaries, which makes standardization a challenge. But I think there's a real desire for this to change, and I think it will change, but I think it will change slowly, because at the moment there are buyers and sellers and lenders with too many different views about what they need to get their PPAs agreed. And fourthly, let's just finish here on some innovation that we're seeing in the market. First of those, I guess, is consortium buyers. We're seeing groups of C&I businesses, commercial and industrial businesses, coming together to combine their consumption to allow them to have a sufficient volume to warrant entering into a PPA. Previously examples, we've seen this with DSM, Philips in the Netherlands, but there's a number of consortia out there now looking for contracts. We've seen a huge increase in multinationals looking for virtual or financial PPA structures in one particular market. They will then use that as a price hedge for their consumption across Europe. We at GE are doing exactly that. So we are looking for a PPA with the Spanish generator to hedge our consumption across a number of different European markets where we don't have sufficient volume in the individual countries. There's quite a lot of considerations in that, as we touched on before: basis risk, the financial treatment of that contract. But we're certainly seeing examples of that in the market. As we touched on earlier, baseload or fixed volume delivery, I think it adds risk to a developer, but where a consumer is buying, or a buyer of electricity through their utility agreement is buying baseload power, we are seeing that being demanded through PPAs, and with that, we're seeing risk management products to manage that, with that sort of proxy generation or sort of volume firming type agreements. We're seeing the growth of different structures to allow buyers and sellers to enter into fixed volume agreements. And then we're seeing cross-border as well. So whilst the virtual PPA gives you some challenges in terms of financial, in terms of the basis risk, we're also seeing the start of financial or physical cross-border contracts, especially with German corporates looking to benefit from Nordic development, and we'd expect that to increase in sort of short to medium term. And then finally, I would say exchange-based hedging. So OMI, EEX offering both baseload contracts, but also shaped products, financial hedges up to even 10 years in some markets. And I think we saw the first one struck in Spain. It requires some challenges. So it requires exchange membership, margining requirements throughout the term of the hedge, and so that's going to be new to many asset owners. But we do expect it to grow, and we expect to see more sophisticated products, including shaped products for solar and wind in different markets across Europe. So I'll stop there. I'll leave my contact details here. We've covered quite a lot in quite a short period of time. I'm happy to provide any more detail about what we've discussed already, or any questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you very much, Alastair. Very, very informing and interesting presentation. I think there are some questions that I have here. One of them, maybe the one very let's to start, which is how come GE is working on PPAs?
How comes GE is working on PPAs? Well, firstly, GE as an investor and developer, we need to find offtake for our own projects, which allows us to secure appropriate financing for them. But we also support customers, so GE's customers, the GE customers being those businesses that obviously buy GE equipment. We'll support them in helping them to find renewable offtake.
Okay, there's somebody also asking, what is the effect of securing a PPA in general terms for financing a project? Does it help? How does it actually influence the way you can deal probably with banks?
Yeah, so what we see, well, if I talk from a Nordic perspective, so GE as a business is very active in the Nordic markets. So we've done 3 or 4 PPAs in the last few years in those markets. The biggest one was a 650 megawatt PPA for 19 years with Norsk Hydro. We've subsequently done one with Google last year. And having those contracts in place allows us as an investor stroke developer to access favorable project finance. So without that project finance, we effectively reducing the financing opportunity, whether that's through equity. And so having project finance in place, what we've seen increases the premium for that project, and ultimately increases the value of that project to the investor stroke developer. There's certainly interest in projects that are fully merchant, but as yet we see far more interested and a broader range of buyers for those projects with the revenue secured through a long-term PPA.
Okay, I have here a question about how much flexibility is embedded in the PPAs on average regarding volume delivery during the year. It says demand has declined during the COVID months, and I'm just wondering how off-takers have coped with this and whether volume delivery can be pushed back within the year.
Yeah, so that is a challenging one. The historically, I'd say there's very little volume flex in the contracts. So the 2 options really to date have been pay as produced. So in Nordic markets, that would be a generator selling maybe 60 to 70% of the nameplate capacity under a PPA. Increasingly people looking at fixed volumes, so selling X megawatt hours per year or per season or even per month. But what we've seen in the last 6 months is buyers requesting volume flex in those contracts. So we'll agree a P50 number, but I want to be able to flex that up and plus or minus 20%. And that's challenging. I'll be honest with you. It's something new that we've seen. We're trying to understand what that means to financing parties. So I don't really have an answer to that, except that we're certainly seeing it. And it's something that I think the industry is going to have to work through, because obviously the seller doesn't want to have that volume flex. But the buyer in the new world we find ourselves in, buyers, requesting some sort of flex to protect themselves against future drops. I guess drops in their own demand for power.
Yeah, there is a question, related a little bit with the previous one, and it says, how common or uncommon is litigation in PPA contracts? Would you advise parties to the PPA to agree to refer any claims disputes to a jurisdiction, England, for example, England, that is more familiar with the PPA concept?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but generally, I think it depends on the jurisdiction where the PPA is written. So, I think in Spain or in Sweden, then we refer it and I guess so. Firstly, where the PPA jurisdiction is written, and secondly, who the buyer is. So if you're dealing with an international buyer, generally they want quite a lot. They want English laws, English courts. But if you're dealing with a local, it's a local buyer, and it's a jurisdiction where PPAs have been written, Spain, Sweden, then I don't see an issue with having it in litigation being in the local markets. So I think the answer to that is I think it probably depends on where you're based and who the counterparty is. We've seen both.
All right. There were some instances, if I recall it right, in the US, especially where PPAs are quite an old mechanism in the European sense of old, where you have from the beginning of this last decade, you had very high prices for PPAs, and then afterwards, now the PPAs are much lower. So there have been some kind of renegotiations of PPAs. In some cases, as far as we know, but it's especially when there were PPAs for wind that were higher than $100 per megawatt hour, and now they are closing much lower. So it's obvious that you need to renegotiate in those cases.
No, I agree. I think.
Go ahead.
No, I was saying, I personally haven't been involved in those contracts being renegotiated, but I've heard that's happened in some instances. And obviously, when you go into the contracts, both parties are going to try and protect themselves against that. I think the prices we're seeing now, hopefully that won't be necessary in the future, and there is some quite significant protection in there for parties. We're both, we're certainly seeing clauses in contracts where, upon, if there's a default or something on behalf of the seller, then the buyer has a right to re-enter those contracts at the same price. So there, certainly people are trying to protect themselves against that scenario happening. So we'll see.
It's a matter of what are the clauses, of course, in your contracts, in order to make everybody feel safe about what you are signing, of course. There's a question here about Would you agree that PPAs are reserved just for a few because of the administrative burden that is necessary, that they entail, or the credit rating? And would you say that are there any ways to make PPAs accessible to more?
So, yeah, I mean, the credit is an issue. I don't think the administrative burden is there. I think the contracts and the understanding of those contracts is improving, and I think there are plenty of advisors, legal specialists who can support. We speak to a number of corporates who say, the first time they did this, they wanted to go through an advisor, but the second time they go to market, they'll run it themselves. So I think, I think the first part of that question about the administrative burden, I think that's becoming less and less as people understand the structure and nature of these contracts. And there's certainly support out there to help you with that. Credit is going to be a challenge for the seller. Depending on how your project is financed, you can access credit if it's required, and more is becoming required for sellers, especially, as we said, through a financial PPA. For buyers, the standard types of credit are obviously PCG, letters of credit, or cash. That's challenging for many buyers. There's only a small pool of investment grade corporates that can to PPAs, but I think we are seeing moves about different types of credit support being offered. So certainly in Norway and some of the Scandinavian markets, there are Norwegian credit agency, but there's export credit in parts of Scandinavia, and certainly at GE, as I mentioned, the 650 megawatt contract that we wrote a couple of years ago was with an unrated counterparty, and we were able to structure sort of credit support on that. So it can be done. We hear that sort of France and Spain, there are discussions about how the authorities can put together some kind of sort of credit support for corporate buyers to try and help this. And certainly with the new sort of EU Green Deal, they are encouraging governments to in some way facilitate renewable procurement, and part of that would have to be looking at credit. More simply, some of these consortia that we're seeing come to the market, not all those agents, not all those buyers have got the appropriate credit rating. So, if a seller is able to enter into an agreement with a number of counterparties, that may reduce the risk. I'm yet to see how that, how lenders will view that, but there's a possibility. So something else is, in terms of credit, it remains an issue. It still remains an issue, but there is movement happening to see if we can change that.
Yeah, but for instance, we know that Wind Europe and Solar Europe have joined efforts in an initiative called Resource, whereby standardization is sought in order to make it easier to sign PPAs for everybody. So, and we are also trying to help a little bit them in the Spanish market in order to let this initiative be known. But still, there's a lot of course, there are markets that are more mature. There's more knowledge about PPAs and how they work, and also the structure itself of the market. In Spain, there are not so many big buyers of electricity, so every market has its own structure. But let me see what there are some other questions here. It says, could you give more details on cross-border agreements in Europe? How does it deal with the rules of local markets?
Well, so you've got the financial cross-border. So that's just that's a separate action to the actual physical transfer of electricity. But on the physical ones, no, we're just beginning to see that moving ahead slightly. So particularly between Germany or Scandinavia selling into Germany, we're seeing third parties able to accept some of the price risk between those two markets for a set period of time, which allows the German corporate to buy a baseload baseload power for I don't know, 5 years or something. But the Scandinavian project can sell into the local market, and there's a third party that sits between the two that manages that exposure. So neither the generator or the buyer are exposed to that, but it does rely on a licensed party to book the capacity or take a position on that capacity between the two markets. So I think it's something that's being talked about a lot certainly in Northern Europe, because of the huge supplier of power in Scandinavia and the huge demand in especially places like Germany.
There was this recent announcement that they are building a new transfer link between Denmark, I think it was, and UK, right?
Yeah.
Across the North Sea. So well, yes, we know that the Scandinavian market. I mean, in Scandinavia there's a lot of hydro and wind, and now wind and also nuclear. So it's very, very low price electricity, and I guess that also influences the prices of the PPAs there. In the meantime, in Mediterranean countries, you have more combined cycle thermal plants that are more or less the thermal power plants. So prices are more linked to gas over here. So they're a little bit higher. So I guess it allows for a little bit better PPAs in terms of prices.
The prices in Scandinavia are probably the lowest in Europe for PPAs. But Spain is not far. Yeah, Spain is also quite a low price environment. You're right.
Yeah, it's not as good as Italy. It's a little bit higher there. There's a question here. It says, have you noticed any change in the terms, conditions in the project finance market pre and post COVID? Spreads might have increased, but on the other hand, base rates are down. Has the all-in cost changed?
Probably not best place to answer that. I know that we're seeing lending rates slightly higher than they were before COVID, but we're certainly we're not seeing a drop in we're certainly not seeing a drop in demand or lenders willing to lend. My understanding is that the cost of lending is going up slightly, but really best place to give any detail on that, I'm afraid.
Okay, there's one more. It says you have referred several times to counterparty risk. Do PPAs include margin calls, additional guarantees linked to the credit rating?
So I don't. So if you were to enter into a corporate PPA with a an industrial company as the buyer, then you would expect them to have the appropriate support in place. So that, as I said earlier, that would either be a PCG from investment grade parent company, or it would be a letter of credit from an appropriate lending bank, or cash collateral, and there'd be clauses in there that said if the rating of the lending entity or the parent entity dropped below X, then that rating, that support would need to be replaced. So yeah, yes, we're certainly seeing those clauses in PPAs, and they've been there for a while now. So yeah, the answer to that is definitely yes.
Okay, we seem to have lost your video, but we can hear you, so no problem. Another question is that pops up, especially now in Spain, is quite an actual, let's say, not problem, but it's a matter of see how the two things live together. Is how PPAs, for instance, can coexist with auctions. There is a lot of talk about auctions in Spain. There's new legislation, new design, which is more similar to other European countries' the design of auctions. And at the same time, the government wants to keep PPAs alive. So how do you think these two systems can coexist?
I mean, it's difficult. I mean, we've seen auctions in other markets that haven't been fully utilised. I think in Italy, in France, not all the auctions have been taken. I think the challenge is the challenge obviously is places like Germany, when the auction price is so much higher than the market price, and then there effectively isn't a PPA market. But so in the UK there's a market for both. So I think it's I guess it's about careful design of the auction, and whether I guess through the auction only the most efficient projects will get selected, and then is there a secondary market for those projects that don't win at auction? I don't know. I think PPAs will continue to be there will continue to be demand for them. The demand from corporate buyers is huge at the moment, and so I think auctions will if auctions are required, then they'll need to be designed appropriately. So interesting to see how that develops.
Yeah, I guess the fact is that, of course, that the more renewables they're going to be, either through auctions or through PPAs, of course the prices are further and further depressed. So the question is at what point the market is going to stop giving signals to investors, and what can you do then? And that's, of course, the big challenge at some point.
And it's a question we're not asking ourselves.
Yeah, we have been asking that questions for a long time, but there is no perfect solution, actually. Yeah. Okay, I don't seem to be any more questions. So if I'm right, then okay, we are on time with everything. I don't know if you want to say, if you have anything you want to share with us. Maybe have you had any experience with PPAs in Spain with the GE?
Yeah, so we signed a 300 megawatt PPA in Spain sort of 18 months ago, which was a financial structure, discount to market. the prices have dropped a little bit since that PPA was struck. But yeah, certainly from GE's perspective, we've got a pipeline of projects in Spain that we're working with, and we've got a number of customers in Spain where we're trying to support them in sourcing offtake. So yes, we've got quite a lot of development activity in Spain and a good understanding of the market there. Yeah.
Yeah. So would you say that it's a difficult market to sign PPAs in terms of comparison, maybe with the Nordic countries or UK, or is it just different?
I think it's hard. Well, I think two things. I think one, the utility market is more present in Spain, so there are more opportunities in that market and with the exchanges in Spain. But conversely, the corporate market is not as mature in Spain. So if I go to Nordic countries, the understanding of corporate PPAs is really good, and there is a lot of demand. I'd say Spain a little bit behind on that.
Okay.
And there's other options. Yeah. There's more other options in Spain.
Good. I think we can finish it here. I don't have any more questions for you, Alastair, but it was certainly a pleasure to share this hour and learn a lot about PPAs and what is happening in the market, which seems to be quite a bit. There's quite a bit of movement and a lot of interest. And well, wish you all the best for you and all the listeners to this webinar. And we hope to have you with us in future occasions to share all your knowledge and all your experiences. Thank you very much again, and to you and GE, and see you soon, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, Eki. Bye now.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.